Kérem Önöket, hogy foglaljanak helyet. Nagyon örülök, hogy azért visszataláltak hozzánk sokan a tegnap.
We are so happy that you came back after yesterday, after this very tiresome day. Yesterday evening we had a longer discussion with Edmund Stoiber, and the truth of the matter is I am always overwhelmed when I see this generation of politicians who, after a 7-hour car trip, gets out of the car, refreshing himself somewhat, and after that practically he will make a speech for 1 hour with a few pieces of printed paper put in front of himself on alibi, but speaking practically freely. And I think this is really overwhelming, and one may consider himself as lucky that they still see this generation which does politics with such passion, such zest, and such knowledge simultaneously. I personally would think that our first discussion of today should be similarly organized, taking the physical and bodily function of those present, great witnesses of great times. That is the title of our meeting today, and they will be indeed here. And when we were considering what should be the motto of this morning of the second day, we thought it would be worthwhile to speak to those who have seen what was going on 30 years ago and who even today are looking very consciously at what is happening in the world today and in Europe. So the question is the harmonization of two Europe. If you can still speak about two Europes, how is it going on? How does it seem from inside Europe? How does it seem from Hungary? How does it seem from the United States? How does it seem from the United Kingdom, which is a special position these days? And how does it seem with the eyes of a diplomat and politician who was part of the changes in the Czech Republic, but then both in the European politics as well in the transatlantic diplomacy played a very important role. Thus, I am pleased and happy that we have among us Mr. Ed Feulner from the Heritage Foundation, the founder of this organization. He is the person who was one of the founder of conservative policy by ideology. So basically, via the Heritage Foundation from the early 60s, 70s on, represented this concept that ever since he has been organizing and actively participating in the political life of Washington. Also, Mr. Charles Powell, who was the foreign policy advisor of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and he saw a lot, I suppose, and ever since so. And I think he is still one of the most well-versed specialists of British policies, and Alexandr Vondra, who I think, if I say that he played a key role in the European changes, and at the side of Václav Havel, and he was a kind of, and he is a kind of living legend in the Central European reformists. Among the reformists of Central Europe, he is also with us. We don't have Mr. Ludger Kühnhardt because his trip was cancelled by Lufthansa, so thus he could not make it today. And on the other hand, we have Mr. Géza Jeszenszky, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of first freely elected government after the political change, and he's a very important specialist of foreign affairs, making important contributions to the various issues of the Hungarian public life. And a witness of great time is also Mr. Gyula Kodolány, who will chair this discussion. Of course, it would be elegant or sensible or polite if the Hungarian participants would speak in Hungarian to the Hungarian audience, but I think we shall liberate them from this burden if they think that from the point of the dynamics of the discussion, because the rest will speak in English, they will also speak in English. So welcome, all of you, and I wish you an interesting and thought-provoking discussion.
Introduction, and we also thank you for your performance yesterday. Because you really had a hard time following Edmund Stoiber's charting his way to Budapest on the German and Austrian and Hungarian superhighways, and he fortunately arrived. Yeah, yes, yes. Okay. This morning I was talking to Clark Judge, Mr. Clark Judge, who gave one of the most inspired addresses yesterday, and the theme of our conversation was that we were very fortunate to have been working with extremely gifted leaders, people who had vision and people who were powerful as politicians and were able to carry out their visions. And of course, the second part of that thought is that the comparison is not very, I think, favorable if we make it with today's world leaders. I don't want to say names, but to us the difference is rather obvious. But let's look at the positive side of this. The positive side of this is that in the late 80s, in the mid to late 80s, in the West, there were some people of vision. There were absolutely first-rate politicians. We might say statesmen, but I don't want to use the word statesman because I think Margaret Thatcher is about these persons. And I think that you can't emphasize enough their share in the peaceful revolutions of the late 80s, because I like to call it peaceful revolutions, just as Chancellor Merkel recently said so. And I think that the other side of the question is that as participant, together with Sasha Vondra and with Dr. Jeszenszky, I think we really also had our share of things of developments that took place. But the really important thing is that there was an ever-strengthening contact between the two sides of this work. I don't want to diminish the merits of Mikhail Gorbachev, but I think that the main actors were the active ones, and the active dynamic actors were really in the West and in our East Central European countries. It was very noticeable that in the last years of the 80s, how the quality of the diplomatic staff at the embassies in Budapest became more and more upgraded. We had better and better quality diplomats serving in Budapest, and they developed a weekly and later daily contact really with the leaders of the opposition. So we are very, very fortunate today because among us on the Western side, we have Ed Feulner, who has been an advisor to all presidents in the last decades, especially, of course, Republican presidents. And whenever they need advice on what their conservative voting basis thinks about the question, obviously the first person to consult is Ed Feulner. And we also have with us Charles Powell, who was personal secretary in foreign affairs for Lady Thatcher. And I had a tremendous luck of meeting Lady Thatcher several times as the aide of Prime Minister Antall. Sometimes when we had very confidential meetings, I was actually the translator because Antall spoke German but no English. And as I said yesterday to some old friends here, when Margaret Thatcher came into the room, it suddenly became full. You felt a living dynamo enter the room, and she was very, very different, I think, from the image that the left liberal Western press tried to present about her. So I think it's at this moment also a very great luck for us that Sasha Vondra is sitting here, because he was our partner in the early years of the 90s when he was the foreign policy advisor of Václav Havel, and we worked together on several important occasions. I would first then give the word alphabetically speaking to Ed Feulner, so that he can, I think, say a little more about the way the United States leaders prepared actually for and worked on what became this peaceful revolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll speak from the Westminster. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be here to commemorate that very special series of events from 30 years ago. For me to try to say how the fall of the Berlin Wall affected Americans is not a difficult assignment. It's an impossible assignment, because every American at that time had a different impression depending on their own personal perspectives. For me, it was very personal. August 12, 1961 was my 20th birthday. I was traveling with 17 college friends on my first trip to Europe, with a Jesuit chaperone, I should add, and we were in Munich celebrating Feulner's 20th birthday at a beer hall. After the beer hall, going back to our very modest hostel, we started listening to the radio, and something was happening. The next day, we were scheduled to take our 2 Volkswagen minibuses and drive through the corridor to West Berlin. All of a sudden that night, my birthday night, troops were massing along the wall, along the border, and in Berlin. We decided maybe traveling to Berlin on August 13th was not a very good idea, so instead we came south and went to Vienna. The next night, of course, the wall went up. So for me, the Berlin Wall was something very, very personal. 4 years later, after studying at universities in Salzburg and Philadelphia and Edinburgh and London, and meeting young prospective leaders and friends, including a young gentleman in London who was a very prominent and promising leader writer at the Daily Telegraph by the name of John O'Sullivan, I ended up at a desk at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington. I was a kid, and my desk was not very fancy, but immediately adjacent to my desk in the front windowed office was a very formidable woman by the name of Eleanor Lansing Dulles. Eleanor Dulles had been the desk officer in Berlin in post-World War II. Her brother, John Foster Dulles, and her other brother, Alan Dulles, are well known to everyone in this room. And I had the great opportunity in subsequent months to work with Eleanor on her book, published in 1967, entitled, quote, "Berlin, the Wall is Not Forever." Well, from CSIS, I went to the Hoover Institution, staff job in the House, and ended up eventually starting the Heritage Foundation in becoming its president in 1977, a founding trustee in 72. But fast forward to where we are now, the year of miracles, when Hungary, our host country, played such a critical role in terms of what happened, when a man I admired very greatly hosted a certain picnic for the pan-European movement, which led the Hungarian government to have the courage to open the border to Austria, and things happened. The Warsaw Pact disintegrated, the Berlin Wall eventually fell, which had been standing for 28 years, and it was breached and came tumbling down. What did Americans have to do with this? Clark Judge has already told us some of the stories about Ronald Reagan, what Ronald Reagan's vision had been early on. Getting very specific, Ronald Reagan took office January 1981. We knew what his policies might be, what he planned for future relations with Moscow, and therefore with the satellites, if you will, of Eastern and Central Europe. His first test came in the first month of the first term, January, February 1981. The Polish Communist government had ordered martial law to clamp down on solidarity. The new American president wanted to respond vigorously. In a meeting of the National Security Council, the minutes of which have been recently released, he said, and he reported this earlier in his own memoirs, that this was, if they were doing this to solidarity, this was a real challenge to the Polish government and to Moscow if solidarity was that important. And he said, "This is what we have been waiting for. What was happening in Poland might lead like a contagion throughout Eastern Europe." That's from his memoirs. Several National Security Council meetings, he met resistance from Secretary of State Al Haig, from Vice President Bush, both more cautious men. But he also met strong support from William Casey, the director of the CIA, from Ed Meese, his longtime counselor, Bill Clark, the National Security Advisor, and Cap Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense. He asked Casey to put forward a plan in terms of how the United States might help solidarity. Casey did, and Reagan did. Later on, Carl Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein fame wrote in an article that he estimated that Washington supported solidarity to the tune of some $50 million clandestinely over the subsequent years. Meanwhile, kind of one level down inside the Reagan administration, you had a lot of activity going on. Charles Wick, a longtime colleague of Ronald Reagan from their days in Hollywood together, was appointed director of the United States Information Agency, that part of the US government, separate from the State Department at that time, that was charged with telling America's story to the world. Overseeing the US Information Agency was a 7-person volunteer advisory group, private citizens, all confirmed by the Senate, and going through the usual ritual of security clearances and the rest. For 12 years under Reagan, then under Bush, and for the first year under Clinton until they discovered me, I was the chairman of that body. We were both Republicans and Democrats, but we traveled around to more than 40 countries. We had the opportunity to encourage our friends in Congress in both political parties to increase funding for Radio Free Europe, for Radio Liberty, for the Voice of America, to increase the activities of the Fulbright program, to produce more American scholars coming to all over the world to tell America's story more effectively than had been happening in the past. It was a very heady time for what we called public diplomacy. fast forward 2 years, March 1983. Anna gave us a brief hint of this yesterday. March 13, Ronald Reagan announces his Strategic Defense Initiative to replace mutual assured destruction. In that speech, he called for America's great scientists who had created nuclear weapons to turn their great talents to give us, quote, the means of rendering the nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. Henry Kissinger, no particular friend of Reagan, said it well retrospectively. These last words, impotent and obsolete, must have had a chilling effect on the Kremlin. Now, with a single technological stroke, Reagan was proposing to erase everything that the Soviet Union had propelled itself into bankruptcy trying to accomplish. I dwell on these early developments because no other president really of either political party, certainly not Jimmy Carter, remember the Iranian hostages, and certainly not George H.W. Bush, a man for whom I have great admiration, but who modestly would declare on numerous occasions, I don't do the vision thing. Well, the vision thing was exactly what we needed from an American president at just that time, and it was so critically important to what was happening. The wall came down not just because of Ronald Reagan, as our host John O'Sullivan pointed out in his most remarkable book. It came down because of the Pope, the President, and the Prime Minister. And I don't think we have a representative of the church here, but I certainly look forward to Charles's perspective from Lady Thatcher's participation. Now, digression as I conclude these kind of introductory remarks before we get into the second round. Franz Joseph Strauss was mentioned several times yesterday. November 1983 was a special month for the Heritage Foundation. November 13th, George H.W. Bush, Vice President of the United States, dedicated our new headquarters building near the U.S. Capitol. Among those in attendance at that building dedication and at the dinner that evening, which featured President Ronald Reagan, was Franz Joseph Strauss, whom I had admired since his days as Federal Defense and then Federal Finance Minister. When the Hanseidel Stiftung approached me the next week and asked me if they could rent space in the new Heritage Foundation building, we agreed with great speed and enthusiasm to have our friends from Bavaria as cohabitants, if you will, of the Heritage Foundation building. 5 years later, just before the wall came down, I was honored to be asked by President Reagan to join Henry Kissinger and our then Secretary of Defense to travel to Munich to be official American delegates at the funeral of Franz Joseph Strauss, to attend the Mass and funeral ceremony in honor of the late Minister-President. So I thank all of our great friends from Bavaria for that long-standing and close relationship. When I come back up here, I'm going to talk about my second great hero in terms of the collapse of communism, who is the leader of the pan-European movement and a man who I got to know even earlier than I met Ronald Reagan, the late Otto von Habsburg. But at the moment, I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Impeccable discipline that you are keeping, because we decided that the format will be three rounds of talks on three different subjects, but I didn't expect that Feulner, with his verve as he started this thing, that he will really stop until our own day. But thank you so much, and I think we are following now as I said, the alphabetical order, and I think it's my friend Géza Jeszenszky whose turn it is on the first theme, and the first theme is really what was going on in the West in the late 80s, and we heard about this from Feulner now and yesterday from Clark Judge. and what was taking place in Hungary, and how was our relationship building up with the defining figures and actors of Western politics.
Thank you very much. Well, now it works. So thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here after yesterday. It works, yes. So after yesterday, I welcomed many old friends, and today I'm very pleased to see some of my former students at the university and my excellent colleagues from the old Hungarian foreign policy, I mean, of the early 90s. Well, this is not the time to tell you about my political memoirs. I published a book about Hungary's neighborhood relations in the early 90s, and it would be a more daunting task to summarize how we acted immediately before the changes and how we contributed to the changes. But obeying to the title of this whole discussion, the two Europes, and how the two Europes came together and how we should maintain this unity, I think I must start my story in 1984, when together with Gyula Kodolány, my old colleague from the university and one of my best friends, to our own surprise, we received a Fulbright grant to teach. To do research was easier, but to teach American students, and we both were invited to the University of California, Santa Barbara. My task was there to teach the history, modern history of what was called Eastern Europe. And immediately meeting my students, I told that I am not going to talk about the history of Eastern Europe because that is the Soviet Union. I am going to teach them the history of Central Europe. Of course, at that time, Central Europe was not even a term much in use because it was customary to speak of Soviet and East European studies. And also the books and authors were usually lumping together the Soviet Union and Central Europe because we, against our will, were members of the Soviet bloc. We were the satellites. We were the captive nations, which was, I think, a very proper term, very infrequently used today. Well, fortunately, we are no longer captive nations, of course. So, first of all, my intention as a teacher and later on becoming involved in Hungarian politics, fighting for radical change, was to end Eastern Europe and to restore Central Europe. Of course, excellent intellectuals in the West were already writing about this subject in the 80s, also arguing, especially some Czech authors, but also some British ones, that yes, we have to restore Central Europe. The restoration of Central Europe was the key to ending the Cold War and for the unity of Eastern and the Eastern Bloc and the West. If I try to summarize, how we Central Europeans, particularly Hungarians, but also Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, too, Slovenes, looked at the world map even in the 80s when the Cold War was no longer threatening so much a nuclear confrontation. So we felt that in 45, when we were just born, it was a great time of great hope. After this terrible calamity of the Second World War and all the genocides taking place, the Holocaust, the Atlantic Charter promised a real, genuine better world, a better world than President Wilson promised at the end of the First World War. And then the great disappointment was that we were not able to realize our hopes. Actually, Hungarian electorate voted 83% against communism in 1945, the last free elections before 1990. But the noble tenets of the Atlantic Charter were of course prevented to be realized by the Soviet Union. So the great disappointment for my father and my family's generation was that, yes, the United States did not honor the pledge. Well, we understood later on that it would have cost dropping an A-bomb on Moscow. And the United States public and President Truman did not feel that after the common struggle of the Second World War against Nazism, it would have been possible, proper, to destroy Stalin's empire by nuclear weapons. Once the Soviets also acquired it, with some American help, of course, with the help of American traitors, it was no longer an option. So then we had to reluctantly accept that there would be a long struggle, which was called sometimes Ostpolitik, sometimes peaceful engagement, and it did not promise to us liberation. It promised a little bit easier life. And after the '56 revolution, when we attempted to change our country and system, following Austria. Of course, Austria was the big example, the state treaty, making Austria a free but Western democratic country. Of course, that prompted very much the Hungarian Revolution of '56. But after its suppression, unlike quite a few of my compatriots, especially writing and speaking about their sense of being betrayed after 1990, I understood as a young 15-year-old student already that helping Hungary probably would have risked at least a Third World War. Of course, I am also critical that President Eisenhower could have done, should have done more, trying to engage the Soviets. George Kennan made, I think, very proper proposals, but he was not listened to, I'm afraid. So we reached the 80s, and I was so pleased, on the one hand, hearing President Reagan saying that this is the evil empire. It was not customary to listen to such words in Western Europe, but we in Hungary and behind the Iron Curtain welcomed it very much. I also welcomed when President Carter's advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, whom we all mourn, I think, said that, well, the United States should pay at least as much attention to, he still spoke about Central Eastern Europe, than the Soviet Union pays attention to Latin America. So I think that started a new American foreign policy, which of course was followed up by Reagan and ended successfully by President Bush. But there were other important players. We heard and spoke about many of them yesterday and also today. And yes, there is no representative of the Vatican today. There are Polish representatives, luckily, but I would like to say that when Karol Wojtyla was elected Pope, not only Poles, Hungarians were also elated. And I recall a Polish joke of the time, but we used it in Hungary too. So according to this Polish joke, in the early 90s, Poles were happy that there was a good Pole in Tel Aviv, Menachem Begin. Then they were even more pleased that there was now a good Pole in Washington, Zbigniew Brzezinski. And the great thing was that now there is a good Pole in the Vatican, John Paul II. And the end of the joke was, when shall we have a good Pole in Warsaw? So, yes, well, we didn't have to wait very long because not 1, but 10 million good Poles emerged, the Solidarity Free Trade Union movement. And that gave great encouragement to the Hungarians, of course, based very much on our traditional, extremely warm relations with the Poles. And it also added to the dislike to our abhor of official Hungarian policy, because just contrary to this traditional relationship, friendship, dvabratanki, the Hungarian communist authorities, who were already quite defeated in the West, they tried to turn Hungarians against the Poles, saying that, well, the Poles are lazy, the Poles threaten our good life because we have so much food and the Poles are taking it away, coming to Budapest and buying up our meat. So I think all sensible Hungarians detested this kind of language. So we came to the late 80s, and I think that with all the literature, all the many books published about that, I am afraid there is no proper recognition to who done it, who is responsible for the changes. Yes, I think here we all agree about the great people, the great leaders, and of course John's book is a good testimony. But one of the advisors of President Bush, Hitchens, Hutchins, of course, yes, Bob Hutchins, yes, sorry. I think his summary of the story was that, yes, all these people made great contributions, but without the Poles, without the Hungarians forming parties, forming Solidarność, and challenging communism, and making use of the opportunity, because we should not neglect that Gorbachev's policies, trying not to change the system, but to save the Soviet system, presented the opportunity. But I am quite certain that if the Poles and the Hungarians had not made use of this opportunity, we would still live in a communist world, at least we in, not Central, but we would still live in Eastern Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I think there are some things which brought hosts of memories to my mind, some of your words. In your last sentence, probably you mentioned Bob Hutchins. Bob Hutchins was one of the chief advisors of President Bush on our region, and he was a constant partner for us in the early 90s. And not only the Poles that were very, very clever in planting people in important places in the world, but the Czechs too, because Bob Hutchins had a Czech wife, I think. In fact, Brzezinski also had a Czech wife. And I think it's important to remember that our partners with the security policy heads of international security policy heads of President Bush later, who were our personal partners, later raised to much higher positions. Bob Hutchins, I think, was the head of the National Intelligence Agency. For a while, Robert Zoellick became head of the World Bank, because these were the people with whom we had direct contact in the first days of the new democracy. But coming back to our theme, because we are now talking about mainly the 80s, I think that the real dividing line is 1977. In 1977, the Charter 77 group comes into existence in Prague. Havel, Václav Havel is imprisoned, and I think this event caused very great stir in the other countries of the camp, especially Poland and Hungary. And I think that the moment when at least two important centers of Hungarian opposition are congealed is really in 1977, and later on these will be the cores of the two leading parties of the new democracy. And it's very important also that during these years of very harsh communist control, the civil contacts, a whole network of civil contacts is being built up among the three countries. So among my friends who later became leaders, among the leaders of the National Democratic Forum, Hungarian Democratic Forum, there are people who had very good personal contacts with the Polish opposition. Again, others had very good personal contacts with the Czech opposition. So it was a strange thing, in fact, finding ourselves in office in 1990 and looking around and seeing old friends who, you know, down at the hill, students and down at the hill intellectuals and students, you know, with canvas bags, were traveling from Budapest to to Gdansk or Prague or Bratislava, and I think this became a very, very important subculture of the three countries, which were otherwise very different. And the Czech connection is very important. I think the Czechs also have to be mentioned because, as Géza very rightly said, one of our great woes was the fact that as a result of the bipolar world which came into existence after 1945, the whole idea of Central Europe was buried because even historians were treating the word in political terms. And I think in this sense, the breakthrough essay was written by Milan Kundera, I think, about the importance of Central Europe, sometimes in the 80s. And I think it was published in English first in the New York Review of Books, when he was already living in exile in Paris. So at this point, I will really give the word to Sasha Vondra, who has been there all the time, I think probably from 77, on the side of Havel. And then if you look at his biography, you find him in the offices of being personal advisor to Havel, foreign policy advisor to Havel, and then I think you were in some even more impressive positions. Looking at you, it's hard to imagine for me that you were defense minister too, but it's the truth. And you were foreign minister, and now you are sitting in the European Parliament. Sasha, please take it.
Nice words. Thank you for nice words also about the Czechs. In fact, starting with the Czechs, so we will celebrate or commemorate our turning point day next Friday. So it's November 17 of 1989. What in comparison to our Polish or Hungarian friends is very late, you know. And I think it requires, because the people are forgetting, 30 years is already 1.5 generation which has passed away since. It was caused mostly because the Czech revolt against the camp of the communism has occurred in 1968 in a little bit different way than the others. So they were trying, to change the system from within. And my parents, for example, who were always anti-communist, were skeptical about the possibility to do it. But it was a serious attempt which failed and which was crashed by the Soviet tanks. And it brought to the power the people who, even in 1989, had no appetite to change anything, because they were the traitors. They were those who were invited the Russian tanks into Prague. So any small liberation would inevitably mean for them to immediately leave. So that was the reason why they were keeping the power to the last moment, when they were even determined to use the force. So they regularly beat the people all over 1989. I was in prison twice in the course of this year. So that's just for the explanation why the Czech transformation has started a little bit later than in Budapest or the worst. So, but otherwise it was a part of the whole domino events throughout Central and Eastern Europe, which I would say, with a distance now, was caused by three key streams, which somehow came together at this special year of 1989. First, without any doubts, the communism was collapsing. And it would collapse under any circumstance, because it was not able, it was in the state of the bankruptcy. They could take it somehow together by tanks, but even, you know, what we have seen, they were so much in the stage of the bankruptcy that on many occasions they were even not able to defend the system with the force in the last stage. That's the perfect example. For example, this conversation between Berlin and Leipzig in a discussion, you know, what to do with this major demonstration in Leipzig, which occurred just 30 years ago, I think, from today. So there was a collapse. Secondly, this collapse was possible because the Western world was playing offense in the 1980s. Not a defense, but offense. And I think politically we should pay our tribute to the Americans, in particular to Reagan. It has been mentioned. Economically, Margaret Thatcher, that was very important part of raising the pressure on the communist system in the era of the business competition. And last but not least, morally or mentally, with the Pope. It worked more, for example, in Poland with a lot of, with a strong Catholic Church, but even it worked in Prague with, you know, a relatively more atheist part of the population. Just a week before November 17, we have undergoing the peak of the process of the canonization of Saint Agnieszka from the Czech saint, and it certainly helped to generate the momentum, because I was released from the prison on November the 10th. That was the day when the Berlin Wall falling down, and the 2 days after, in front of the church, in front of the cathedral in Prague, there was a huge gathering, and it was building the momentum for what has happened in November 17th and afterwards. And finally, what has Géza rightly said, the third stream was this constant challenge, challenging the system from below by our nations. Hungary, 1956, Czechoslovakia, 1968, Eastern Germany, even 1953, it was almost forgotten. And in particular the Poles, repeatedly, you know, 56, in the 70s, and then, you know, 1980-81, the Solidarity movement. There was something, you know, what served as an initiation for the young men. You know, I was less than 20 years old and was coming to Poland with my friend, and, you know, this is something what I would never forget, you know, leaving. That was a time still I could travel, then later on they forbid me to do that, but that's I could. And if you leave, you know, this foggy atmosphere in Czechoslovakia, in, you know, the peak of the normalization, there was nothing just to do, and suddenly, you know, traveling to Gdańsk, to Warsaw, to Krakow, to Wrocław, to Częstochowa, it was, you know, for the young people like to get the oxygen, oxygen of the freedom. And thus, you know, this November 17 in the series, you know, it's now a state holiday, but has a special place among the Czech state holidays. You know, we have some Czech Statehood Day, we have the Independence Day, with I see Georg Habsburg here, so sorry for that, but we are celebrating, this is the Independence Day. We are celebrating the May of 8 as a Victory Day, but November 17, the key word is not the independence, it's not the statehood, it's not the victory, it's a liberty or freedom day. And we have decided with Václav Havel shortly after that, it's not a state to organize anything. So it's always, you know, by the people from below, every year. And, you know, this is important that we should not lose the liberty again. And we are in the danger. And we will be in that more and more in future. And I hope we would discuss this later. So we have to stay in charge of that. And what is important, maybe to finish with that, to play offense again. Because, look, in 1989, we were lucky in one sense that geopolitically it plays in our favor. United States were strong, determined to act, they were in offensive. Europe was optimistic, open-minded, welcome us in the market. And Russia was weak. Gorbachev is, you know, he deserved the credit for giving up. But they were giving up. So, ideal political setup. Central Europe was full of individuals who were able to play that. You know, in Hungary, Géza belongs to them. In Prague, Havel and others. So we do have the players. And now I think the West is not playing offense anymore. And we have to play offense. I started this trip, you know, I was in Leipzig this week, in Bratislava last evening, a week before I was in Wrocław. But I made a stopover in Barcelona on Tuesday because my team, Slavia Prague, was playing against Barcelona. Barcelona is the best football team in the world, with best player in the world, and their method is that they are constantly in offense. Yeah? 80%, they have the ball on their legs. Slavia came not to defend, but to equal that ball possession. It was still physically very, very demanding for the players. And we became the third team in the last 4 years who did not obtain a goal in no camp in Barcelona. It was a draw, 0-0, because we were playing offense. So David was able to play against the Goliath by playing offense, not defense. If you are playing defense against Barcelona, you have no chance. And this is something what we should re-energize ourselves to play offense for the freedom and not the defense like we are playing last couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. You have to be aware that the applause came this time for Slavia and not for you.
Thank you.
For Slavia Praha. So let me now give the word to our very distinguished colleague, Charles Powell, who I think was in a unique position of being at the very heart of the foreign policy forming thinking, the vision and the workshop of Lady Margaret Thatcher, who I think cannot be really rated high enough as a player in this great game and in general. And Before I give the word over to Charles Powell, let me just note that some of the speakers at this table already noticed that George Habsburg, the eldest son of Otto von Habsburg, is here with us. And his father always spoke excellent Hungarian and always said that he was a Hungarian. And George is in his footsteps and doing important voluntary work in Hungary. And thank you very much for that, George. And now I'm giving the word over to Charles Powell.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I've already learned in fact, today, that the reason that the Soviet Union and East Germany built the Berlin Wall in 1961 was to keep Ed Feulner out. They failed in that aim, I'm afraid, because he kept popping up on the other side of the wall and making their life very, very difficult. But now at least I know what was the starting point. And I very much appreciated also Alexandr Vondra's remarks. For those of you who think his loyalty never shifts, at the end of this meeting, I do suggest you examine the socks he's wearing today. They are the Barcelona colors. Obviously, I agree with a great deal of what has been said already. My starting point would be a time in the mid-1970s when Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, two extraordinary politicians, both out of office, met in London and agreed that they really shared the same broad aims when they both, as they hoped at the time, got into government. And one of the most important of those aims was that the West had been too supine in its dealings with the Soviet Union and with the communist system. That we had settled for détente or peaceful coexistence or Ostpolitik, whatever you like to call it. That simply was not enough. The aim had to be to bring down the communist system, and that required a different, very different policy to the one pursued up until that point. Now, of course, that change of policy, which happened after Margaret Thatcher won the election in '79 and President Reagan in 82, in 80, was evinced in the change of language. We've already heard this morning of the reminder of the evil empire rhetoric, which I think I could say Margaret Thatcher fully matched and which earned her probably the greatest benefit she ever had from the Soviet Union, which was the title of the Iron Lady, which was awarded to her by the Red Army magazine. I think they probably regretted it ever thereafter, as she made extraordinary use of it. And so a hard line towards the Soviet Union, exerting the maximum pressure, that was the strategy of the early part of the 1980s. But as we got closer to the mid-80s, Margaret Thatcher took the view that another wing of this policy needed to be developed, and that was to work on what she regarded as the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union, and that was in Eastern Europe, where one could see that things were beginning to stir. And she thought that that could be encouraged, developed, to the point that it would greatly increase the difficulties of the Soviet regime. And it was this conception that led her in 1984 to invite herself, which was quite often in her case, invite herself to visit Budapest, where she came and where she had some very interesting meetings with the then party secretary Kadar. But what really impressed her in 1984 was her now notorious visit to the Budapest marketplace. And there, it was almost like a revelation of a biblical sort. And she said afterwards that she really sensed that underneath the veneer of communism in Eastern Europe and of Soviet domination, the heart of democracy was throbbing away, awaiting the moment for expression. And that is what encouraged her from that point onwards also to develop discreetly. She didn't want to be too provocative, unusually. She didn't want to be too provocative and lead to Soviet retribution, to encourage progress in Hungary and in Poland and in the Czech Republic. And in Hungary's case, that led to Mr. Kádár coming to London in 1985 and a subsequent Prime Minister coming to London, and to Margaret Thatcher visiting Budapest again in 1990 to meet Mr. Antall. And in parallel with that, she, a little bit later, she visited also Poland to meet Solidarity. And that was a very interesting visit because, of course, the government was in the hands of Jaruzelski, who wasn't too keen on the idea of having Margaret Thatcher visiting him to meet Solidarity. So we had an extraordinarily well-planned visit in which half of it was spent with the Polish government. And then at a certain point, when we were in Gdansk, having visited the Great War Memorial there, Margaret Thatcher and I were taken to a hotel in the middle of Gdansk, put in a room, and every support from the Polish government was withdrawn. The security, everyone. We were just the two of us sitting in a room, looking at each other, wondering what to do next. And as so often in these cases, what happened next was really nothing for quite a while. And then after about 20 minutes, the door opened slightly, and the very recognizable head of the leader of Solidarity appeared, and immediately withdrew again and shut the door. And we wondered, well, was this it? Was this the meeting with Solidarity? But then, after about 30 seconds, the door reopened, and the great leader appeared being pushed from behind by one of his assistants to enter the room. And that started a relationship between the two of them, which I think was interesting in its effect. We had lunch with him and his supporters in the rectory of his priest's church, and then attended Mass there. And it, I think, helped there move things forward in Poland. And the final sort of interesting part of the visit was the departure. It was quite late in the evening, and we were at Warsaw Airport, and the Prime Minister of the day, whose name I can't remember, was there formally to bid farewell to Margaret Thatcher. And just as that had finished, and she turned to go up the steps of the aircraft, a car came speeding across the airport, right across the runway, screeched to a halt. Out jumped General Jaruzelski with a very large bunch of roses, thrust them in her arms, saluted, turned on his heel and disappeared. That's one of those curious memories that one has of those times. And in a completely different atmosphere in Prague, Margaret Thatcher had met President Havel. He came to London, and Alexandr Vondra was there too, and will be my witness. But then she went to Prague and was very excited about this because he had just become president. And one of her great vices was she was always too anxious to be on time for a meeting, as a result of which she was almost always early. And we sat in the British Embassy, and she kept saying, "Charles, come on, we must go, we'll be late, we'll be late." "No, Prime Minister, just keep in your seat, we'll be there on time." "No, no, no, we must go." So we went, and we drove up the hill to the great castle, and we got to the gates, and there was the Guard of Honor drawn up, and there was the band. And she got out of the car, whereupon the band started to play, and the commander of the guard advanced and saluted and invited her to inspect the guard. There was no sign at this point of President Havel. So she thought, well, I might as well inspect the guard. So she inspected the guard. And just as she finished, out of the castle by a side entrance, running and putting on his jacket at the same time and trying to tighten his tie, appeared President Havel, and came up breathless and said, "Oh dear, I'm so sorry, what shall we do now?" And she said, "Perfectly simple, we'll inspect the guard again, this time together." So one does have some amusing memories too from that time. Let me just, while we're talking about this earlier period, pick up on one point from yesterday which rather impressed me. I sometimes had the impression yesterday that people thought that Hungary and other East European countries had somehow regained their freedom in something of a vacuum. Now, none of us deny, we couldn't possibly deny that the first credit, the most overwhelming credit, goes to the people of Hungary, the people of Poland, people of East Germany, people of Czechoslovakia. Of course it did. But it could never have happened without the context which had been established. And that context was the decision to take on communism to lead to its defeat. And that, of course, was greatly aided by the change in regime after a number of very elderly Soviet leaders had dropped off their perch, and Mr. Gorbachev had replaced them. And I was sorry to hear yesterday one or two people say, well, yeah, Mr. Gorbachev, yeah, he was okay, but it wasn't really much to his credit. It was very greatly also to his credit, I have to tell you. I mean, here was a man who really stood Soviet policy on its head, a man who was not prepared on moral grounds to use force any longer, to be in the way that earlier Soviet leaders would have done, I think, unhesitatingly. Such was the nature of the regime. And I think he does deserve very much a share of the credit. But the question was more of the broad pressure on the Soviet Union, which of course was not just about helping East Europe to get its freedom. It was much more than that. I mean, we had our own objectives, thank you very much. There was a massive nuclear power which was known to be targeting the UK just as much as it was targeting the United States with nuclear weapons, because we had them too. And our purpose in working to defeat the Soviet Union, if you like, was at least as much that as to help people in East Europe obtain their freedom. Now, fortunately, the two, as it were, two aims combined and came together, and that is how it happened. I think when we're on this first part of the discussion, I would add one other aspect, because I know people were going to ask me about it anyway, and that was Margaret Thatcher's attitude to German reunification. Margaret Thatcher had invested hugely in Gorbachev. He had come to the United Kingdom in 1984, the same year that she met Kadar. He was just joined the Politburo. Nobody knew anything much about him. The reason he had come was we had thought we ought to try to identify the next generation of Soviet leaders. And she'd held a seminar with a lot of academics to discuss this. And we'd come up with three names. One was Romanov, who was the party secretary in Leningrad, subsequently dismissed and a notorious drunk. The second one was called Grishin, who was head of the Soviet trade union movement. And the third was Gorbachev. And we didn't know which to invite. So with characteristic British diplomacy, we invited all three. And Mr. Gorbachev was the one who accepted. And he arrived in the UK. Unknown figure. We really knew nothing about him. And Margaret Thatcher decided to welcome him in Chequers, the Prime Minister's country estate. And it has a great sort of baronial sort of hall, a blazing fire. And into this environment stepped Mr. Gorbachev, who from the very first sight you could see was a totally different proposition to all previous Soviet leaders. Not only was he younger, he was bouncing on the soles of his feet, he was smiling, cheerful, and accompanied by an elegantly dressed Mrs. Gorbachev, Raisa. And from the very first moment the two of them sat down to lunch, and this is where the note-taker's nightmare starts for people like me, they argued. Course after course was served, neither of them ate a thing. I wanted to eat my lunch, but never got a chance. And they debated vigorously. And Margaret Thatcher told President Gorbachev, well, he wasn't president then, but Politburo member Gorbachev, from the very beginning, that communism was an evil doctrine, and if he had any wish to change it, he wouldn't get very far because it was unreformable. Now, I think any other Soviet leader might have walked out at that point, but he didn't. He engaged, he fought back, describing what he thought needed to be done, and criticizing many aspects of the British system, some of them rather justifiably, I have to say. And from that was born a relationship which, from trying to remember now, embraced at least 9 separate meetings up until 1990, so spread over 6 years. And during that time, although I dare say at various moments President Gorbachev found Margaret Thatcher extremely tiresome, I think he also valued her as a sort of anvil, of the sort on which a blacksmith would hammer out his ideas, because if he could get her to accept at least some of them, then probably nobody else would be too difficult to persuade. And so, having invested all this and seeing things beginning to move in Eastern Europe, when the idea of German reunification came to the fore in the second half of 1989, she was frankly alarmed. She thought that if German reunification suddenly appeared on the agenda and started to move forward, this would put Mr. Gorbachev at grave risk within the Soviet Union from hardliners, from the Soviet military and others who would fear he was going too far and would remove him from office. And President Gorbachev himself seemed to share that view, as indeed did several other Western European leaders, including most notably President Mitterrand of France, whose rhetoric on the subject of German reunification was a good deal more extreme, I will tell you, than Margaret Thatcher's ever was, and that's saying something. So this led her to feel that German reunification was something that should be pursued in slower time. We shouldn't just rush to the point of German reunification. There should be a period of, obviously, had to be some negotiation, leading probably to a confederation of the two parts of Germany for a year or two, while adjustments were made, federation, and then finally reunification, let us say over a period of 5 or 6 years. And that was a vision shared, again, at the beginning by several West European leaders, and even, I have to say, by President Bush in the early part, before James Baker convinced him that support for immediate reunification was the right way forward. It was not an unintelligent policy. It really was a policy aimed at preserving the context in which Eastern Europe could achieve its freedom undisturbed, without a backlash, without the Soviet army intervening again. It was a policy that failed. It failed because the momentum of events was simply too powerful, too strong. And Chancellor Kohl read that momentum very well. He was like a man on a surfboard. He rode the wave. He never expected reunification to happen when it did. He wasn't even in Germany when the Berlin Wall came down. He was abroad, I've forgotten where he was, somewhere in Scandinavia, I think, had to come rushing back. But he did read the signals extremely well, and he carried it through peacefully. And the fears about Mr. Gorbachev's position were, of course, realized. Fortunately, they were not realized. He wasn't dispossessed for another 18 months, but it was not unwise to worry about it. Nor were the fears that Germany might demand to leave NATO or become neutral and that sort of thing. But once again, it was not an unintelligent policy, even though, as Margaret Thatcher herself remembered in her autobiography, written by a certain John Sullivan, that her policy failed. Thank you. I'll stop at that point, Chairman, and perhaps come on to the future and subsequent intervention.
Thank you very much, sir. I think it was a very, very insightful address with the best virtues of British understatement and elegance. And I think at this moment it's impossible to resist for me to invite your colleague at Margaret Thatcher's office, our friend John O'Sullivan, to say something. I asked him before the meeting, John, you should say something, but then he very modestly withdrew. But I think you, John, you were mentioned on account of your book, on the Pope, the President and the Prime Minister. This is one thing. And I guess you can also join in some way Mr. Powell's words, and that leads us over into the early 90s, in other words, how the West helps the new democracies. So please come ahead and say a few things here. Yes.
I will be very brief because I haven't prepared any remarks, and I don't really have a great deal to add to what both Ed and Charles have said from their different perspectives. I was fortunate enough to go directly from working in Downing Street to National Review in the United States, having previously worked for the Heritage Foundation. So I did get to look at things, so to speak, from the standpoint both of London and Washington, which was very useful indeed when I came to help Lady Thatcher, along with Robin Harris, on her on her memoirs. I was very glad that Charles addressed the situation of Gorbachev in the way he did. Now, that's how I'm just going to add a brief remark on that point. At the time when I'd written my book on Reagan, Thatcher, and the Pope, I found it very interesting the different countries I was in. There would always be the same question, to which there was always a different answer hoped for by the audience. And the question was, I agree with you that these three major figures played an enormous role in the change. And secondly, I had also, whenever I spoke, I addressed the question of the role played by the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe in their own liberation, which I think too others have addressed to say was absolutely crucial, and was the Velvet Revolutions were not actually carried out by the three protagonists in my book. So that was crucial too. But there was always a question, but don't you think that X played the major role as well? And the interesting thing was that it was in Poland, of course, the question was always addressed about President Havel. The name expected in Poland was, of course, Lech Wałęsa. But the name that was always raised in Western Europe, I would add another couple of names by way of statesmen. One would be obviously Chancellor Kohl, whose arrival in power was extraordinarily important in that stage of the Cold War in solidifying West German opinion. And I think if we look at West German foreign policy since the war, we have to say that he and Chancellor Adenauer were the two major figures. Willy Brandt was, of course, a very important figure, but Ostpolitik was a historical dead end in a way that the commitment by Adenauer to the West was crucial in establishing a democratic Germany in the short and the long term, and the actions of Chancellor Kohl in ensuring that the strong neutralist current that was running on the German left, in a sense, was simply diverted, and Germany's commitment to the policies that brought about the change was total. So they were all very important. But the name, of course, that people in Western Europe always wanted to hear was Gorbachev. And I think that, there were good reasons for this. And Charles just outlined the reasons very effectively, and I completely agree with him. However, there were some people in the West who wanted to give due credit to Gorbachev because they didn't really want to give it to Reagan, Thatcher, or the Pope. And therefore, there was a kind of commitment to him which was ahistorical and ideological, which made no sense. His actual role was vital, and it came to, in a sense, a slightly sad end, because the coup against him, although it failed to preserve the system, did in effect bring him down. And he was then replaced by a much more dramatic figure, in a sense, Yeltsin. But Yeltsin failed, it seemed to me, to carry through the promise of his early years. And as a result of that, Russia did not remain committed to the West, as it did in the first 3 or 4 years very, very dramatically. So we did miss, as a result of Gorbachev's disappearance, so to speak, his sidelining following the coup, I think we've missed the opportunity to close the final deal with Russia, which we might have done. I don't think I want to add more than that. Thank you, Géza, Gyula, for the opportunity, but I think I should resume my position as a member of the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, John, very much. Gyula will be back in a minute, but just asked me to take over until he can come back. So, yes, I think we have reached the happy ending. Communism is over, and well, then started the daunting task, especially for this basically united Europe, united Euro-Atlantic world. Well, how to restore the economy, how to restore the market economy, which after 40 years there was no continuity. And the great responsibility for that obviously rested with the new leaders of Central Europe, and of course rested also with the leaders of the world. John mentioned that Yeltsin, despite the great promises, and yes, I think we had great confidence that he would bring Russia. Now, he did not oppose the breakup, and that, I think, is his great merit. He should still remember by history that the Soviet Union disappeared peacefully. That was even more important than the peaceful transition of Central Europe. But yes, later on, perhaps because of some drinking and other bad habits, he failed. But also what the United States, how the US stood up to this challenge, and we all remember George Bush announcing a new age. So I think at Feulner, you can share with us how you saw those years.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The fall of the wall really was a new era for all of us in the United States. I brought with me a bookmark that I keep on my desk every day, which is a piece of the wall that I, together with the Heritage Foundation board, traveled.
Can you hold it higher?
Yes.
So that everyone sees.
Traveled to Berlin 3 weeks after, the first week of December, 1989, and actually had to rent from a very entrepreneurial capitalist a sledgehammer and a chisel to go at the wall and break off chunks of it. And it symbolized a system built on a very fragile foundation, one that could not last. And there, I mentioned before my other hero of these battles. That was Otto von Habsburg. I had the great honor of meeting him in 1965 at his home in Bavaria. And at that time, I commissioned an article by him that appeared in an obscure little American journal called the Intercollegiate Review in September 1966. The title of the article is difficult. The Effects of Communism on Cultural and Psychological Politics in Eastern Europe. I will not read the whole article. I will read, however, one of the last sentences. This records the decisive defeat the system has suffered, a defeat which is no longer directly related to economic success or crises, to foreign policy, or to the strategy of domestic politics. The cause of this defeat, rather, must be looked for in the psyche, which in the long run will, the personal psyche, which in the long run will not tolerate shackles. Otto von Habsburg, 1966. Ronald Reagan, 1984. Socialists ignore the side of man that is the spirit, They can provide you shelter, fill your belly with bacon and beans, treat you when you're ill, all the things guaranteed to a prisoner or a slave. They don't understand that we also dream. Those are my two heroes. Bush 41 served just for 4 years. It was a time of tumult in the United States. Did the United States do everything it should have or could have in terms of reducing debt from the communist era, of, as we used to talk about, of a new Marshall Plan for Central Europe? No, we didn't. Yes, EU and NATO accession eventually, with strong American support, achieved a great deal. Did it achieve everything we wanted it to? Certainly not. Democracies don't work that way. They're messy, conflicting aims, divided people, created obstacles to achieving shared values, and politicians, as a reflection of the people, the voters, tend to lose the longer-term perspective. Everything is decided in the context of the next election rather than the next generation. I remind my friends that so many in Washington have a viewpoint that the urgent often overwhelms the important. Fast forward, 9/11. We're through the Clinton years already to George W. Bush. It changed everything. Our concerns about what was happening in Europe disappeared, other than the fact that we were calling on you for assistance as we entered into a long war. Unlike our European friends who, going back to the 16th century, know what a 30-year war is like, in the United States we seem to be having trouble dealing with one even 18 years. It's not an excuse, but it's an explanation of what we might say has been a reduced interest on the part of so many in the United States in the continuing success and the continuing development of what's really going on. And this, unfortunately, has been reinforced. Bush 43, young Bush, received commitments from the Czech Republic, from Hungary, with regard to anti-missile defense systems. Bush is succeeded by Obama from the other party and with other viewpoints, and Obama reneges on those commitments after both the Czech government and the Hungarian government suffered some political pain that all of you well remember. This does not lead to reliance on a dependable ally on the other side of the Atlantic. And perhaps that's the subject for another conference on another day. But regarding the ideological war these days in the United States, we find ourselves in the midst of another civil war. It goes back to Gramsci and the march through the institutions. And in the United States, the media, the academy, and so much of our culture has been taken over by individuals who do not believe in what I would call our traditional values, a respect for the individual and a preeminence of individual human rights. The problem is, to a very great extent, that the history of what Central Europe, what the former Soviet Union went through, has been erased for the new generation. People have forgotten what it was like to live through this time. Generations are being born and only being taught the attractive points of the ideology by a Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or whoever, without learning about its inherent structural defects. Something that my generation didn't count on was that people would forget what it was like to have a Berlin Wall, to live under the threat of potential aggressive action from a worldwide threat. What we lived as history is to them inconsequential, irrelevant, and alas, unknown. What that means is that it's up to us to tell our children and our grandchildren about Venezuela today, about North Korea, about Cuba, about China's great leap forward, and yes, about the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall, and tell them about Karl Wojtyla, about Václav Havel, about Joseph Cardinal Manzetti, and about so many other heroes who are just forgotten on our side of the Atlantic. The fight for individual freedom is never ending. It's a real struggle, we all know this. It's what I and so many of us have dedicated our lives to trying to expand and preserve as best we can. It requires determination, and it requires steadfast optimism that, yes, we can really make a difference. And that, Mr. Chairman, is why I thank particularly our colleagues here at the Danube Institute for calling us here together, not just to remember what happened 30 years ago, but to say, hey, we can build on that, we can do better, we can make things better, and we can tell future generations what it was really like as we look to the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. I think Ed Feulner performed two great tasks. One, that he really raised the conversation to a very high level, rhetorically speaking and intellectually speaking, when he came down to our own day. That originally would have been our third theme, but I see that time is flying fast, and so probably we will make shortcuts, and in fact he made the shortcut already by his own speech, so that was the second thing you achieved. So I think that we will not really speak much now about the early 90s. Allow me to say just a few words about partnership with the leading Western countries in the first years of the 1990s, but then I will give it over to my other friends from Central Europe, Géza Jeszenszky and Vondra, to reflect on our present place in the West, along the lines, or maybe contradicting what Ed Feulner said. But let me say a few words about the early 90s, because I think it was a high point, really, in the history of our nations. I think it's unforgettable for us, who at the time were active in politics, at the top echelons of politics, together with Sasha and Géza, how warmly we were received by all leaders of all the great leaders who were today mentioned at this table. In other words, Margaret Thatcher, George Bush, the elder, François Mitterrand, in fact, Chancellor Kohl. So, you know, my compatriots very often tell me, and I think they are right, and Ed Feulner also, in fact, made some hints at that the West, financially speaking, and in the area of the economy, was not really prepared and up to the historical moment. They could not help us as much as we hoped. Basically, the idea was a second Marshall Plan. And as George Bush writes in his memoirs, he really felt ashamed when he came to Budapest, first time in '89, and he offered $25 million to Hungary. And he describes in his memoir how Condoleezza Rice and Brent Scowcroft, his most important colleagues in the National Security Council, the policy center of the United States, were trying to persuade Treasury Secretary Brady and the American Congress to give help to these countries. And finally, only Poland succeeded, because Wałęsa's incredible presence in the Congress, the way the man himself and the way he spoke there, brought a relief in the Polish debt service. But you have to remember that the debt burden on Poland and Hungary were enormous. Nevertheless, I think on the strategic level, and let me come back to my first sentences, I think on the strategic level, these people were absolutely on top of the situation. They were partners, they were friends, and I think we received enormous help and enormous encouragement to our own difficulties at home. And we cannot forget the push for early NATO membership on the part of President Bush. We cannot forget the very warm meetings with Margaret Thatcher, because contrary to the Iron Lady image and also to the image partly spread by the British press, she was a very warm-hearted and colorful human person who absolutely came through in a meeting because she was very direct, and she immediately won you over. But I can say the same thing about Mitterrand, who asked József Antall about the Balkan crisis, what to do with Yugoslavia, and George Bush phoned Prime Minister Antall several times to discuss international problems. So I think that we had the luck to feel that we became really part again of an integrated world, and that the unification of Europe actually took place. And of course, we are not talking about the unification of Europe, we are talking about the unification of the Atlantic world, as it became very obvious from what our American speakers said here today and yesterday. I think Jaspal wants to say something.
Just make a very brief observation before our two colleagues come in with what will be very important remarks, because it's relevant to the support which Hungary and other countries got. Margaret Thatcher was always convinced that Eastern Europe should be brought into Eastern and Central Europe should be brought into the European Union at the earliest possible moment. She was appalled that it took 15 years for that to happen, and regarded it as a great stain on the record of the European community or European Union, that for purely protectionist reasons in parts of Europe, that membership was held up, the negotiations protracted, and all sorts of excuses found. It was frankly shameful. My second point would be that she was also very keen on seeing Europe move forward in a way which would make it easy or easier for the newly freed countries to be part of it from an early stage, which is why she argued for a more flexible form of Europe, for avoiding the sort of deep, tight integration, which she thought would be very difficult for countries which had just emerged from under the shadow of the Soviet Union to accept, and which would be anyway difficult or impossible for Britain to accept. And I think the wisdom of her view on that is borne out today, as you see more and more populist movements emerging in Europe, and frankly it is the reason for Brexit. I mean, we would not be facing Brexit now had Europe been prepared to be a bit more flexible. There's no great deep anti-Europe feeling in Britain. In fact, there's no anti-Europe feeling at all. There's anti-bureaucracy, centralized authority in Brussels feeling. And if that could be eased or be taken more slowly, we would not be in this mess today. And I think that applies very much to some of the attitudes one now hears emerging in the parts of Europe we've been discussing. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I mean, you really spoke from our hearts. Thank you so much. And I think I give now the word over to my two colleagues from Central Europe, who will also comment on the same problems, I hope.
Well, now, you know, in the light what we have looked for or wishing for 30 years ago, I think this is a positive part of the story. So we have a working democracy and freedom as a political system. It's a standard Western arrangement everywhere across Central Europe. Economically, we have open market economy, capitalist system, and the wealth of the society is growing year by year. And internationally, we reach an anchor within NATO, so we do have the security guarantees. And we are the part of the European Union. So far so good. Here just a small addition. I do understand from the perspective of the grey power politics your words about Gorbachev, and I agree with you. At the same time, maybe I would say one nice word about Boris Yeltsin. I understand that from the perspective of the great power politics, you know, if somebody is drinking and moving back and forth, it's a little bit of problem. At the same time, you know, to have a president in Russia with whom you are going to drink for an evening, and at the end of this drinking expedition, he makes a promise, you know, to tell next morning in the press conference that he has nothing against the NATO enlargement. And he did it. He was keeping the promise overnight to the shock of the remaining squad in Kremlin. Look, from the perspective of a small-sized country, it was like a miracle. And
Pasha, forgive me for interrupting you, but when Yeltsin came to Budapest in '91, he said that he is asking for the forgiveness of the Hungarian nation for what the Soviet Union did here. But there's a second part to that. When Yeltsin was making this speech in Hungarian parliament, for some mysterious reason, the loudspeaker system went out of service. That tells you something about our difficulties in trying to change the country which we took over.
Yeah. So this is a positive part of the story, but well, now I think we should be careful because all those gains are under some threat. We have a political problem here because this mounting progressive way which dominates now the Western discourse is leading us to the culture war. So it's about the division of the societies, not about bringing them together. Secondly, this green madness, which, you know, would be very costly without, you know, any guarantee of the effect, because if Europe is performing this soft power leadership and nobody would follow, so it would be costly and we would get nothing in reward here. So it can transform our societies too, because this costly exercise would build a huge pressure for our redistribution of the health in the society. And we have here a real problem of, you know, this melon effect, which was discussed much earlier with regards to the first generation of green, but they were somehow cultivated. But now this danger of, you know, having a green cover but the red inside, I think, you know, I do have a concern, and that's just made daily, based on the daily observation in the European Parliament and elsewhere. And then last but not least, we also have a lot of uncertainties about our geopolitical or institutional gains. You know, in the EU, with UK leaving, we are losing a balance in a triangle between London, Berlin, and Paris. Instead of the triangle, and within the triangle, the small countries could live with that somehow, because the compromise was somehow what we could live with. But now we will have axis of stronger Germany and weaker France. And if the US is going to depart, and now it's under Trump, it's still part of the system, although it's a transactional, and Europe is not offered to offer anything in reward. So we do not see the transactions yet here. And if Sanders or Warren are going to win, that's the end. That's simply the end. So then the winker in Paris will look eastward, and this is exactly what we can see. You know, Macron is using this weakness of the German policy right now, and it's on the wild right, you know. In August, declaring a reset with Russia, yesterday sending a NATO into a funeral, today in China, so wow, wow here, yeah. So, you know, we can easily be exposed rather to the new problem than to the solutions which do we have. And well, you know, to survive that, it needs a strong performance at home. Hungary has it, Poland has it, thanks God. I'm critical about the Czech current leadership, but we'll see. You know, we need to be a guardian of our achievements 30 years ago. Otherwise, we can lose it very quickly under the current earthquakes.
Thank you very much. I think you are still under the effect of the football match today between Barcelona and Slavia, because sometimes you spoke in shorthand, but that's because you are very passionate. You are very passionate about the things that are happening.
A dissident.
Yes, that are happening to us through Brussels, and of course, we are very sad about Brexit. In fact, just to reflect on what Charles Powell said, because I think Great Britain, among other things, was really the counterweight in the European Union for the federalists. You know, please, I'm giving word last to my friend Géza Jeszenszky on present developments.
Yes. Well, it is very difficult to present a realistic and still positive or hopeful picture of Europe today. Prime Minister Antall, in his last address, foreign address, before his untimely death, he warned that in his fear, or in his vision or his fear, fundamentalism, political fundamentalism, would be the Bolshevism of the 21st century. Nobody then, listening to him, all the European leaders of the European Democratic Union in Budapest, September 1993, nobody believed how true that prophecy would turn. We did not...
Yeah, you mean Islam fundamentalism?
Well, he did not mention Islam.
He did mention Islam fundamentalism. I remember how Western leaders were taken aback when József Antall in the early 1990s told them that Islam fundamentalism is going to be the Bolshevism of the 21st century.
He was, in fact, a friend of Islam as a culture, and not unfriendly to the Arab world, but certainly he was aware that fundamentalism is the greatest danger among the Islamic countries. And actually, he had great hopes in Turkey at that time, because he thought that Turkey would be a secular alternative to fundamentalist Islam. Very sadly, it did not turn out that way. But if we try to somehow explain why we have not reached that happy state which all of us, West and East, expected that in 30 years' time, well, we did not expect that Hungary or Poland or Slovakia and Czech Republic would have the prosperity of Germany. But certainly we expected more prosperity, a more prosperous economy. And actually that is one of the reasons why there is disappointment on the one hand in the former captive nations, because most people welcomed, of course, freedom, but the average man and woman expected prosperity, and this did not come. Of course, the economic performance of these countries with some, very positive developments has not up to the expectations. Also, probably it was not realistic to expect a new Marshall Plan. But my problem is not that money flow was not coming, but not in time. We know that time and tide waits for no man. And we waited, not simply money. We can see that in East Germany there was ample transfer of funds from West Germany. And what is the state? What is the mental position of the former East Germans? It is certainly not a happy kind of sign of the achievements. Well, in fact, the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction, I think it had $20 billion for the whole bankrupt eastern part of Europe, a ridiculously small sum, and even that was very difficult to be used. So we see that the dangers are certainly there, where Islamic fundamentalism is mainly responsible, obviously, for migration. And on migration, there is no disagreement, but there's no sufficient agreement among the European governments. I think the basic agreement should not be simply how to handle, how much to admit, but how to make sure that there is no need, there is no cause for this mass migration, for the flow of refugees. So as long as the Middle East is continuing to be in turmoil, and actually in more turmoil than ever in the previous 20th century, so then we can not be sure that there is no uncontrollable emigration. As long as Africans multiply every year how large percentage, and well, Nigeria started 30, 40 million, and now 180 or how many? So birth control is inevitable, and we don't see it. Of course, the best birth control is prosperity, as we see in all European countries. So I think that what we need is that unity among the political leaders, what more or less existed in the early 90s. But yes, we see and we all deplore that the great leaders in the West and the great leaders in Central Europe are gone, and we don't see the people who would be ready and able to take their place. So I might not be fashionable when I say that Europe is not in decline. If it is in decline, we will all be gone. The Untergang des Abendlandes is an old prophecy, but fortunately it has not come true so far. And it is up to us whether we can meet the challenge and we can make Europe as large, as important, as united as James Baker proposed and prophesied and so on. So if the United States abandons Europe, well, then we have to accept it, although we hope it will not take place. After all, the big lesson of the two world wars was that, the old world and the new world united can handle all the challenges. And these challenges, yes, certainly, climate or the issue, the debate over that is a challenge. Migration is a bigger challenge. Russia, the new ambitions of Russia. Putin is not Yeltsin, and his shortcomings, or anyhow, his attitude is much more alarming than the drinking habit of Yeltsin was. And China, well, China is even more dangerous, as I see, because China is very intelligent, China is hardworking, China is now a world power, but I don't see that it is a peaceful power. Building up such a huge war machine as China does. Well, it is only the US which can meet it, but I think even the US cannot meet it alone. So European leaders, I think, should realize that disunited, well, they will not meet these challenges. This united Europe would mean undoing all the great achievements and the hopes and promises of the great changes 30 years ago. So it is not up to our generation who was so active 30 years ago. It is up to the new generation to solve these problems. These problems are not impossible to solve, but they need imagination and they need unity. And one last word, if I don't want to miss this special Hungarian problem. We expected so much good from the changes, including a fair treatment of national minorities all over the world, for the Kurds certainly too, and for the Hungarians outside Hungary. And one of the reasons for the average Hungarian disappointment is that their lot has not changed. It has changed, it improved compared to Ceausescu's time or Husák's time. But I think that here we have to understand that the vision 30 years ago was not simply a much larger Europe. It was the Europe of the regions, decentralization, if you like. I, as a patriotic Hungarian, I believe in the future of the European nations. But I don't see that this dichotomy is really real, that the alternative is either federal Europe or the Europe of the nation states. I don't think that Europeans will ever be ready to abandon their culture, their language. They will never adopt either English or an international language, even Esperanto. It was an illusion. But I think that we have to realize that in today's Europe and in the future of Europe, I don't think that it will be multiculturalism as prophesied or expected by some, but it should be a Europe which we see in South Tyrol, which we see in Scandinavia, that it is possible for majority nations and minority groups to live not only peacefully together, but in fair arrangements. And that should be the solution for the non-European population of Western Europe. This is the biggest challenge, obviously, but if we can close the borders is not enough. How to deal with this? How to reduce the danger of terrorism, fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism? Certainly not by simply closing our eyes, but there are more Muslims in Russia than in Western Europe. So Russia should be a partner in that. I understand that the partnership with Russia is desirable and many European countries want that, but also it has certain basic promises, basic requirements. So we have to settle the Crimea. I think there is possible solutions, but neither Russia nor Ukraine is ready for a compromise, a kind of bilateral responsibility. So the problems are more daunting today than 30 years ago, and certainly the future is not without history, but too much history is war, and that is which we should certainly prevent and pray not to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think perhaps that each of the participants of this roundtable should be given the right to have one final sentence after your very eloquent performance on the world situation, Géza, perhaps starting with Charles Powell at the end of the table.
I would only say that it's been a very valuable discussion. It's unearthed a lot of history, a lot of reminiscences, and a lot of indications as to how things should be handled in future. Thank you very much to those who organized it so beautifully.
A very good and productive conference, an opportunity to meet old friends, to meet new ones as well, and to talk about the future in a positive way, working together for our shared objectives and shared viewpoints. Thank you.
The same, you know, it was great to see after many years Géza, Gyula in a full form. Charles, excellent. You know, I have to invite you to Prague to educate the young people about Margaret Thatcher. And, you know, Heritage Foundation in the era where everything is changing, so it's like an elephant standing on the right side. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for all of you being with us and for this long debate of more than 2 hours being with us, apparently following the discussion with sympathy. Thank you and have a nice day.
So thank you very much, Gyula, for your kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I was not too much what I've promised in the beginning, to listen to this great generation. That was really a very joyful event, very interesting one. Thank you very much for your experience. Thank you very much for your knowledge. This university, this city, Budapest, should be a center for thinking about Europe, about Central Europe, about transatlantic friendship and partnership. That is a very important fact that you are with us, and I can only promise further invitations will follow. Thank you very much for that. Tisztelt Hölgyeim és Uraim, én nagyon köszönöm mindnyájuk.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for all that you have been here with us. Thank you once again to Danube Institute for their participation, and to Noémi Korányi personally. Thank you, and I thank my own staff too at this National University of Public Service, who brought about a lot of sacrificial work in order to be able to make this almost 2 days conference successful. Thank you to the interpreters too. And for their participation, and also some information that in the main hall where yesterday's reception was held, now we shall have a humble lunch expecting you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.